So this lecture will be about adverse childhood studies, which we also call kind of ACEs. So in this field, we've really noticed that early experiences and how you are treated in the environment that you grow up as a child affects your development across your entire lifespan. But communicating this to people outside of our field has always kind of been a challenge. There have been ideas about how children grow that have definitely changed generationally. So my husband is really lucky enough to have his grandparents still alive. So they are in their early 90s. They were born in the 1920s. My husband's grandfather went to World War II as a 17-year-old. I mean, he's had this amazing, rich life. Talking to him about Korea, going to Korea and Vietnam. He was in the Marine Corps for like 40 years. It's fantastic. He doesn't actually, though, really understand what I do because for his generation, children were at home or they were with a babysitter if the mom had to work or if parents were in war, like World War II. Things changed a little bit that way. But the idea that children have mental health issues or an infant being really affected by things that are happening around them is somewhat kind of mysterious to him because he was not in a generation where those types of things were communicated, and children, while you should be nice and kind to them and you should try to make their lives as best as possible as a parent, the types of things that we're talking about seem really kind of mysterious to him. So what we're trying to do is take these ideas of things that we know about how adverse experiences that happen to children, violence, parent being incarcerated, poor nutrition, all of those things can negatively affect the development of a child. It can negatively affect their brain development, and that in turn will also affect their education, not only in preschool, but their formal elementary school education as well. And it can have some issues with health outcomes. And the interesting thing about this is that this actually started in the 90s with Kaiser. So Kaiser Permanente is this huge healthcare business, and it started out in Southern California, and they were looking at weight loss, actually. So they had almost 20,000, so 17,000 of their members in their HMOs, and they started doing physical exams, and they wanted to know if some people were having much worse health outcomes than others. So they actually, that's a huge amount of people. That's like, it actually becomes something of an epidemiological survey, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But so they were doing physical exams, and then they also had confidential surveys looking at their experiences, what kind of situations they were raised in, and then what their current health status and behaviors are. Are they smoking? Are they overweight? Are they having difficulty sleeping? And then also looking at this data that they had collected on the childhood experiences that they had. Well, the CDC has been really interested in this, and they are continuing to have surveillance of these ACEs, and they are actually also looking at our medical status of morbidity and mortality rate, which hopefully sounds familiar to you, and that's kind of an epidemiological area. And the CDC, so the Center for Disease Control, does most of that data for us because it's very huge. It takes a lot of manpower, and it takes a lot of money in order to do studies like that. Some states on their own, though, have also started to collect information with this behavioral risk factor surveillance system, which is also through the CDC. So you can go to that website and you can see how states all over the country, not just in California, have been collecting data on people, their health status, when they pass away, and then what kind of early experiences they had. So this is kind of how it started, which is kind of really fascinating too, that about 20 years ago we were doing this data, and now the ramifications that we have. But I want to just talk about the people that were in it, since this is a class where you are learning a little bit about research. It was 75% white, 11 Hispanic, 7 Asian, and 5% African American, so it skewed mostly Caucasian. But most of them, almost the entire study, were people over 30, so middle-aged people recollecting or giving you information in a questionnaire form about the early experiences that they have or that they remember. And then almost 50 of them were over the age of 60, so they were even more in middle age. They were in our older generations. Then we also looked at college experience as well. Most of them had some college experience, AAs, trade school, and then 36% had gone to college, maybe not graduated, but had gone to a four-year university. So it was quite a much smaller percentage had not graduated or had a GED. So when they were looking at this cohort, and a cohort is just kind of like a group of people that you follow. I am in a cohort study right now at Palomar College. So myself and 10 people are in a second cohort, and they are looking at me, my cohort, and how we are able to use free resources like Zero Textbook, Calm, that type of stuff in our classrooms. So, and then I was previously in a cohort at UCSD and Rady Children's Hospital where we were looking at parent coaching. So they were looking at how I coached parents before the study started, when the study was starting, and then after the study was completed, to see if by receiving 12 weeks of education about parents and how they were and their children, how my early intervention work was changed by that. So I've done that quite a few times. But really what they were looking at over here in this graph was, these are the ACEs, and the dark one is the CDC, so this is that kind of original study, and how many people were reporting 1 ACE, 2 ACE, 3 ACE, 4 ACE, or more. And an ACE is an adverse childhood experience, and it typically, when we're talking about it, we're categorizing it into 3 things: abuse over here, then neglect, and then household dysfunction. So the abuse is your typical physical abuse, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse. Neglect is emotional neglect or physical neglect. And then household dysfunction is things like a parent being incarcerated, substance abuse, violence in the home, or divorce. So when they were looking at this, the abuse, so the participants who were in this original study reported that 28% of them suffered some kind of physical abuse, 20% sexual, and then 10% emotional. With neglect, 14% emotional and 9% physical. Household dysfunction, 26%, so the largest number was in substance abuse, 23% divorce, 20% mental health. 19% was domestic violence, and then 4% was a parent in prison. So why does this kind of information matter? Well, by categorizing an adverse childhood experience, and then having such a large amount of participants in a study, we are able to see that as the number of ACEs increases, so does the risk of a negative health outcome. So it's much smaller. So if you have 0 ACEs, there was no abuse, there was no neglect, and there was no household dysfunction, you have a better chance of having a health outcome, and you might also live longer. The more ACEs that you have, though, the more risk you have for having a negative health outcome, which can include lack of physical ability, lack of physical exercise, smoking, any kind of like substance abuse yourself or drug abuse yourself, and then the physical and mental health, obesity, diabetes, depression, stroke, cancer, broken bones, STDs or STIs. So there's a lot of negative health outcomes that also come along with being exposed to kind of adverse childhood experiences. All of this information I actually learned in 2014. Every September, the UCSD and the American Academy of Pediatrics puts on an infant mental health clinic, an infant mental health conference here in San Diego. If this is really interesting for you, I would love for you guys to attend that. It's called the Infant Mental Health Conference, and it's once again with UCSD and the American Academy of Pediatrics. I would look in, because you guys are college students, I would look into getting scholarships in order to go. I try to go every year. It's a fantastic opportunity. And they fly in keynote people. So we have this guy named Bruce Perry, and Dr. Bruce Perry, and then Dr. Mark Katz. They are kind of the pioneers in this field, and they have spoken multiple times at these conferences over the years. Because we are looking at infant mental health. I'm an early interventionist. There's therapists, occupational, physical, mental health therapists, doctors, pediatricians, elementary school teachers. We have politicians going. So it's a fantastic opportunity to look at early experiences and why they matter. So with these stressful or traumatic experiences, abuse, neglect, and range of exposures, they are a leading cause of illness and death, as well as poor quality of life. So people who reported 6 or more ACEs, so that's a really high number. So that's like domestic violence and child abuse and neglect and but we are learning that they died 20 years earlier than those without any ACEs. So the more ACEs that you have, the more negative health outcomes you have, and the possibility that you will pass away up to 20 years earlier. And that's really, really significant. I remember the first time I heard that, it was like mind-blowing that somebody could be passing away in their 50s and 60s because of these early experiences that they had as children. So that's why we're seeing these lifespan ramifications about these early experiences. Most participants in the original study, though, reported more than one ACE. So that's pretty typical. You had domestic violence or you had substance abuse. But that still is going to have a negative health outcome on you. Another thing, though, as well, is we can see that brain development, and my head's in the way, but brain development kind of supports this. And that's what I remember Dr. Bruce Perry talking about. Is he's from a university in Chicago, and he was trained as a pediatrician, I believe, as well. So he has a lot of access to information like this, like brain scans, brain studies, and then just wide ranges of people who either come into his clinic or into studies that he or his university have put on. So we know that brain development is affected by a lot of different things. It can be like alcohol abuse or drug abuse during pregnancy, but it's also affected by trauma and chronic abuse or exposure to violence and drugs. So after the child's come out of the womb, we have, a fresh baby brain, and we know that the early experiences are either going to lead to rapid growth, or because of trauma, abuse, violence, drugs in the house, that can also change the composition of the brain. The brain can be pruned if you're not using those connections. It's the process of pruning. They'll be taken away, they'll wither and die. So we know that these images over here on the left-hand side are CT scans. So it's when you go into the big thing. And we're looking at a healthy 3-year-old with an average head size. The image on the right is a 3-year-old who is suffering from severe sensory deprivation and neglect. So that's like a couple of months ago, there were those children that were like trapped in a closet or their home by their parents out in Riverside, and they were in closets, and there were 29-year-olds, but people thought they were like 17 or something like that because they hadn't been able to grow. That's severe sensory deprivation neglect. So that's very rare, but look at the difference in the brain. I mean, it's a significant amount that the brain has been impacted by this neglect and abuse. So most children, even if they are in an abused home, they're not going to have that huge kind of neglect, but it is going to show that there are some changes in the brain as well if you are exposed to kind of chronic abuse or violence or drugs or anything, or any of these ACEs. So it's kind of a bummer subject. I think that it's really important for us. It gives us a vocabulary to talk to older generations or people who aren't in our field about how these early experiences matter. But what can we do? So we have risk factors: a chaotic home environment, ineffective parenting, caregivers that are not responsive or attached to you, academic failure, poor coping skills, external approval for drug use. So you're older, you're a tween or a teen going out and trying to get approval from your peer groups who might be engaged in risky behaviors themselves. So there's all of these things that are risk factors or health outcomes that if you've had adverse childhood experiences, you might go in that direction. They're also protective factors as well. So even if you had a parent who was incarcerated, you might still have a really strong family bond. And so we know that our personality, our temperament, our environment, all of these things kind of play into us and how we deal with adverse childhood experiences. So you might have a really heavy experience in your life, but if you have a strong family bond, or you have parental engagement in a child's life, or caregiver engagement from a teacher, an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, something like that, that can boost you and that can give you a protective factor so that you can deal with something really heavy. Because of my work with children with special needs, and before that I worked with a lot of at-risk children, either in drug and alcohol rehab. I worked at program here in the North County where we worked with mothers whose children, mothers and children, and the mothers were getting clean after having issues with drug and alcohol. So we know that those children were being raised in an adverse childhood experience. Their parents used, there was often a lot of homelessness, low income issues, things that went along with that drug abuse as well. But we were trying to raise their protective factors. That was kind of our goal at our program, was to forge, to create, to make, or to support strong family bonds, and then a parental engagement in the child's life, setting boundaries, limits, teaching them to be responsive parents. And I did that a lot. I had a lot of families that I needed to sit down with, and we needed to literally teach them how to play with their child, how to meet the needs of two children at a time. So if you have an infant and a toddler, how can you possibly, when you are very young and you are newly sober, how can you meet the needs of both of those children? So if we have those protective factors, the child's going to be able to deal with the adverse child experience of having drug abuse in their household because they have a family bond and they have a parent that is staying engaged and responsive in their life. There's also some other ones as well. So parental expectations and consequences, making those limits and those boundaries, which are so important for young children. Academic success, and that's part of that pro-social institutions. So a lot of children see life and school, especially school, as a safe place. So if their home is not safe, they make their school safe. They join sports. They try to stay there as long as possible. They have deep bonds with their teachers. They sign up for tutoring. So if they have a strong bond with their church, their community, or their school, which is a positive factor in their life, then that is also protective factor. So if they have academic success, people like them at school, they're able to do their schoolwork, their teachers are responsive to them, that's also a protective factor that can insulate them from an adverse childhood experience, which is going on at home. On the other hand, though, if school isn't a safe place and home isn't a safe place, then you're probably going to go search out an adverse child experience of your own. So you're going to search out drugs, you're going to search out violence, you're going to search out gangs for belonging, in order to make your own protective factors for yourself. So this is how, as a community and as a society, we want to raise and uplift children who are going through really heavy or difficult things. So what can we do with this? So we know that there's adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. We know that they have long-term implications for health and health outcomes. How do we use this information? How do we use this research-based information that we have? I think a great thing is that it can help physicians understand and begin to identify and treat early childhood mental health. So most of our pediatricians focused on the health, which is really, really important. We want them to be able to see a child who's sick and give them antibiotics, or send them to a specialist, or get them a splint for their knee, stitch up their leg, that type of stuff. That health is very important. But a lot of times they don't have a lot of training in child development, kind of what happens to children on our side, how do they develop normally in physical domain, social and emotional domain, and cognitive domain. And then also if there are mental health issues, there are adverse childhood experiences in that child's life, what do they do then? It really depends on how much the pediatrician has kind of done their own research into this. So we want to give pediatricians this information because there's this DSM, a diagnostic material that physicians use, and psychiatrists and therapists of all kinds use, and it has like ADHD, anorexia, things like that. It doesn't have early childhood mental health, and that's something that we want to change. We want to have that added to it. So we want them to be able to identify things in the moment so that they can identify that children are going through an ACE and get them the appropriate treatment, which can involve home visiting programs. I'm an early interventionist. That's what I do. I see a lot of ACEs in our community, and I've kind of built up my own network, or I know a lot about social services so that I can hopefully help the families if they are wanting help from me. Parent training programs, which is something that I do as well, and that's part of the research study I did with UCSD and Rady Children's Hospital, was looking at social and emotional delays and coaching parents through that. Intimate partner or domestic violence prevention programs, mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment for the parents that are going through that, so that they don't make that mental health or they don't make that substance abuse into an ACE for their child. So they need to have protective factors so that they can stay sober, so that their children don't have to grow up in situations like that. And then high quality childcare. So we know that sometimes school can be a protective factor. The more high quality your childcare is for younger infant and toddlers, that can be a protective factor as well. So ACEs in school. So the fantastic thing is that now we have this idea of trauma-informed schools. And they take this information of ACEs and they translate it into programs that support children. So this is a quote from a teacher. It hit me pretty deeply that no matter what I do in the classroom as a teacher, kids come in with a whole bunch of other stuff. So if you are a victim of abuse in your home, how can you start to learn long division? You're in a stressful, chronic, ongoing situation. That's going to take up a lot of your time. That's going to be affecting your development. It's going to affect your ability to do homework, affect your ability to get to school, to have clothes, to have trusting relationships with people around you. That abuse that you are suffering or you are witnessing in your home is affecting your development in all areas, and it of course is going to affect your development at school as well. So San Diego Unified School District, this is a direction that they are kind of starting to go into, is have trauma-informed schools. So how can we raise the protective factors? How can we build resilience in children? And how can we get them the social services to end that ACE that they are going through? So we need to go to the root cause. We're not just going to teach ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. We're going to look at that root cause of why is this child having a hard time learning. If it's an ACE, we're going to identify it and we're going to form treatment for it. This is a very new field though, so I wouldn't say that any of us have these kind of information, this kind of trauma-informed school down pat. It's a constant learning experience as well. The Monarch Child Care Program down in San Diego, which is part of St. Vincent de Paul, they are also doing that as well because they work with homeless children. So their they don't have a home, they live in the tent city that we don't have down in East Village, or they're couch surfing, or they live in cars. How can we support the family and support the child so we can get rid of that ACE of like very high poverty? And then there's also a really cool trauma-informed practice in Wisconsin where they do a really fantastic home visiting program that actually California and then the early interventionists that I work with out here and our groups that we've formed professionally are looking into taking some of this information in Wisconsin and Early Start, so that's kind of the statewide program that does children with special needs. They are working more. That was an area that they identified as a need, is the social and emotional part, which goes into the ACEs, and how can we meet the needs of families with social and emotional difficulties so that they can support their children with special needs. So this information, this research-based stuff, and this huge research study is now trickling down, and it's starting to affect actually the children. So we're not just studying it, we're trying to make changes around it. So further readings, so if this is cool to you. Dr. Mark Katz, who's a PhD, Dr. Bruce Perry, who's a doctor, and he has a doctorate in this. They both come out here a little bit to talk, and they also have their own websites within their universities where they do this study, and it's amazing. If you ever have the chance, they're online as well. Dr. Bruce Perry actually spoke to Oprah. He was on her show before it went off the air. And then a couple weeks ago, Oprah had a 60 Minutes article, a 60 Minutes article about this as well, just last week or the week before, where she's talking about early trauma and adverse childhood experiences. So those would be areas that you could check out if this is interesting to you, because once again, remember that you have a policy paper that is coming up. We're halfway through the class. This is due the week before, I believe. So just know that you need to kind of pick an area to kind of do some more research within kind of the scope of the pre-seed proceed model. And then this last website is from ACEs Connection, which talks about San Diego County and the trauma-informed schools that we have in San Diego and the way that we are using ACEs in San Diego in order to make some changes with children's lives. I'm going to jump into the pre-seed proceed model though. You guys a couple weeks ago mentioned cohort studies. So I had the video about epidemiology, and this by and far was the design model that you guys showed the most interest in. So it's cohorts, most likely. Our samples, they're followed and evaluated, and then, So a cohort, a sample, a group, a person is followed, and then evaluations are conducted to determine which initial participants had risk factors associated with it. As the study is done, outcome from participants in each cohort is measured and relationships with risk factors is studied or determined. So once again, I'm a cohort at Palomar College. We are studying open educational resources, OERs, and then we have COM. Over at Palomar, it's COMET, Affordable Learning. And over here, it's Cougar Affordable Learning, and this is a zero textbook class. So I have been learning about this on my own because I very strongly believe in no textbooks, basically, at this point. They're exceedingly expensive. So I graduated in 2005. My husband graduated a couple years after that, and I paid all of his books. And I remember at UCSD spending like $800 and $900 one course, or one semester, and it being ridiculous. Now, if we were able to do that, we were kind of looking on Amazon at all of those books. If we were to buy brand new books for that, it would have been $2,000 for his science, anatomy, physiology, all of that type of stuff, because he works in the lab industry. So if we had done all of those books, it's just insane. So I very much buy into the zero textbook, and I'm so glad that this class is. So I have been trying to learn, and I've been trying to find sources for you guys this entire semester, because this is my first time ever doing this. So I also signed up for this research study to get some more information. So they are going to have me work through, so I'm doing conferences and I'm learning about Creative Commons and things like that. When the study is done in a couple of months, they're going to measure the ability that I have, or how I report in a questionnaire on my ability to understand and to provide either a zero textbook or lower cost textbook options to children. So that is how I am a cohort. The strengths is that it can be cheaper and it can be shorter in duration. So Palomar got a grant from the state. I get reimbursed a little bit for my time in order to do it. And it's going to be quite short in duration. I think we will have wrapped it up by the end of this year. The vulnerabilities is that it is not random. So this cohort at Palomar is not random at all. There are 10 people in my cohort. I have 3 other child development people who are in the cohort with me, because it was basically who signed up and wanted to do it. They did make some decisions finally at the end, but so if there's 4 people out of 10 in a cohort that are child development, that is not random at all. It'll probably lead towards our department hopefully being zero textbook, which I think would be fantastic, and I think that's why they were willing to do that. That's not random at all. We have very few math, science. I think it's cinema, child development, world languages. I think there might be 1 math person, something like that. So it's not random at all, and that's one of the vulnerabilities or the weaknesses of a cohort study. So I do want to give you an example of a cohort study, and this is from George Washington University, who has really good tutorials on study design. So if you need a little bit more information on epidemiology, cohort studies, just social science research design in any way, please go to the George Washington University Himmelfarb. I think that's the lab that they have. But a cohort study was designed to assess the impact of sun exposure on skin damage in the beach volleyball players. So there's a weekend tournament. So 1 team wore waterproof, 1 team just wore SPF 35 non-waterproof, while they wore waterproof SPF 35 sunscreen, and then on the other team, no sunscreen. So at the end of the weekend volleyball tournament, their skin from both teams was analyzed for texture, sun damage, and burns, and then they had comparisons of the skin damage were made based on the use of the sunscreen. So that's going to show there's a significant difference between who's wearing sunscreen and who's not if they spent all weekend out in the sun. Once again, it's not random at all. It's a bunch of volleyball players. So we're not looking at the population as a whole, but that's a way that we can follow them. And then at the end, we can look at the risk factors by looking at the damage, looking at the type of sunscreen that they had access to. So I hope that gives you a little bit more information on cohort studies, because you guys were mentioning that was an interest of you within epidemiology. So this is an image. I always like to give images as well. So there's the population of interest, the exposed subjects, or the unexposed, so the controls. So we're looking at sunscreen. Some of them are wearing SPF 35, waterproof. Some have no sunscreen. And then we're going to be looking at the outcomes. With an outcome, without the outcome, were they burned, were they not burned? So this is kind of where we would find cohort stories. Cohort studies would be within epidemiology, which would be within phase 2 of our pre-seed, proceed framework. So this week's reading is going to be really difficult. I have tried to make a balance between reading things that were really interesting, things that supported child development knowledge as a whole, and then things that support pre-seed, pro-seed knowledge as a whole as well. So this is an adolescent violence prevention practices among California pediatricians, and I'm less concerned about the child development in this age. We're not covering adolescence. That'll be your 303 class that you'll go into, but I think this is a really good study in that it looks at an ACE. It looks at an adverse childhood experience of violence among teenagers in California. It's a difficult thing to read because it is very research-based, and that's why I want you to read it. Is I want to expose you. This is a very typical thing that you will be reading. It talks about validity, measures, questionnaires, variability, things like that. So what it's kind of looking at is using the pre-seed, pro-seed model as a theoretical model to guide a questionnaire that they sent to pediatricians to identify a pediatrician's ability to screen and then intervene in adolescent violence. So they were engaging, adolescents who were engaging in violence or had violence in their home or in their community, how they could identify and then intervene and provide social services to those adolescents. So I think that's really important. I think it's taking the idea of an ACE and that this is an adverse child experience. How can we make it better for you? While you are reading, there's going to be some vocabulary while you're reading this. So I want to kind of go through some of these words so that you have a little bit more understanding as well. And then I also just want to bring up, when I was doing my master's program, and this is where you go really heavy into research and things like that, I had a whole separate binder. It was actually just like a spiral bound thing. And it was my vocabulary kind of word because I didn't know what any of these meant. I would have gotten it in class, but it didn't make sense until I was really starting to read through a lot of research. I did my master's dissertation on bilingual education. And so as I'm reading through that, I had ideas about theorists, about research models, about what does this mean. So I would write it down and I could either go back to it or in that moment, I mean, I had Google. So I could go to Google and I could try it, or Wikipedia, or just the basics, and try to understand what these vocabulary meant in order to give me a bigger understanding when I read these really research-heavy papers. And if you guys are looking to go into kind of this field or any other field that you're going to go into, you're going to have to read research like this. So that's why I'd like to do it in this class where I can be supportive. You're writing a weekly reflection about it, which is you trying to learn it on your own, being exposed to the vocabulary, and then kind of reporting back to me things that you did learn, things that were difficult. It's a way for you to kind of communicate with me, and I can give you feedback on it as well. So I want to give you the vocabulary so that it can hopefully help you as you're reading this article. But if it's still not working for you, go on YouTube, go on Google, go on Wikipedia, try to give yourself a little bit more understanding if this is not enough for you, which I would understand if it's not. I also actually have some additional readings, which is an OER. So this is an open educational resource that I have just found in the last couple weeks, and it's on research design and methods. So this is basically a free textbook source that I found that is going to give you easily accessible information about how you set up research design and how you set up methods in order to support your understanding of the pre-seed, pro-seed model. So while you are reading the article on violence in adolescence, these are some of the words that might come up. So a sampling, what is a sampling? Typically, it says you select a unit, but a unit is just a fancy science word of people or maybe an organization. So you're looking at people from a population of interest, and you're studying that sample so we can generalize our results back to the population from which they were chosen. So you could look, it would have been interesting in that cohort study to maybe look at people by race line. So if you have Caucasian and you have less melanin in your skin, if you were another race and you had more melanin in your skin, so you can generalize maybe about sunscreen use and exposure to the sun by like melanin levels in your skin. That would be something where you would use sampling. A questionnaire, we kind of know what a questionnaire is. It's just a research instrument, and it's questions for the purpose of gathering information from the respondent. So you'll see in this article that they sent out questionnaires to a bunch of pediatricians in California because they wanted to gather information on how they were currently asking children, if they were asking adolescents about violence, and then if they were asking, in what way were they doing it, so that we could look at generally, in a sample of pediatricians in California state, how are they generally starting to gather, how are they generally identifying violence in the home or violence in the community for adolescents? Then a measure, when we're measuring something in social science research, we're observing and recording the observations that are collected as part of a research effort. So just, you know, when I did my dissertation, I actually observed in a classroom. So I was observing and recording when and how children used Spanish and English in preschool classrooms. Then there's variables. So there's independent variables and there's dependent variables. So a variable that's independent is not changed by variables. So my age, I'm middle-aged, I'm white, those types of things are going to change through my lifespan, obviously, as I get older, but they're not impacted by somebody else's. When my husband gets older, it doesn't, you know, what my husband's age doesn't impact my age. I'm always going to be 2 years younger than him. It's never going to change. When he turns 38, I will turn 36, that type of thing. A dependent variable, on the other hand, is influenced by another variable. So when you took the midterm a couple weeks ago, how was that influenced by your sleep? How was that influenced by your study ability? How was that influenced by if you actually watched lectures? That's a variable that can be changed and influenced by the other variables around you. And then there's also data analysis, and I'll talk about this as well in that research study that you're going to be reading this week. So systematically applying statistical or logical techniques to describe and illustrate, condense, recap, and evaluate data. So in our ACEs, we have 1,700 people that took part in this Kaiser ACE thing. How would they apply logical techniques to describe, to illustrate, to condense, to recap, and to evaluate data? In the study so large with 17,000 people, and they're looking at so many areas, it took a long time to be able to take all of this data, disseminate it, look at it, tell us what it's saying about childhood. And that's why sometimes research takes on a mind of its own. Kaiser was probably not thinking 20 years ago when they started this, that this was going to lead to the research that we have now. They were looking at how do we make people in our HMO healthier so we don't have to pay as much money. I mean, that's literally what they were looking at, and it has turned into how people respond, how older people responded about their early experiences turned into this whole ACEs thing. So data analysis sometimes can have a mind of its own, but we do have to do it systematically, and we do have to do it within a social science framework, which is systematically and statistically looking at the data that we have compiled. You won't do this in your undergrad work. Most likely you will be exposed to it. You might do mock studies. You might come up with what you would do or ideas what you would do. But data analysis is more of master's level work. I did a little bit of it, in my master's program when I was looking at bilingual education. So that is something, all of these things you will learn more about as you go through these courses. And if you go farther in your education, you'll have whole classes devoted to this. This is to give you a basis so that you can go to this reading and you can have some understanding about the precede proceed framework and how we use these things within the precede proceed framework. So that is it for this lecture on adverse childhood experiences. I hope you guys are refreshed coming back from spring break. Please do the weekly reflection and post in the forum as always. Thanks so much and have a great week.